I always believed a woman knows when something is wrong in her own home, even if she spends years pretending not to see it. That thought stayed with me the morning I found the photograph hidden inside my late husband's old toolbox. It was a quiet Tuesday in October, the kind where the rain taps softly against the kitchen windows and the whole house feels heavier than usual. I had been living alone for almost 3 years since Arthur passed away, and most days followed the same routine. Coffee at 7. Watering the hydrangeas by the porch. Watching the mail truck crawl past my driveway at exactly 11:15 every morning. At 68, routine becomes a form of comfort. At least, that's what I told myself. That morning, I decided to clean the garage because winter was coming early to Vermont. The air already carried that sharp, cold smell that settles into your bones. Arthur had always handled the garage himself. He used to joke that if I touched his toolbox, he'd haunt me forever. I smiled thinking about it as I lifted the dusty metal box onto the workbench. Inside were old receipts, rusty screws, faded Polaroids from fishing trips, and tucked beneath a stack of yellowed manuals, a photograph I had never seen before. My fingers froze the second I turned it over. Arthur stood beside a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, both of them smiling in front of a lake cabin I didn't recognize. Written on the back in Arthur's handwriting were 5 words that made my stomach tighten. "Summer with my real family." I read it again, then again. The garage suddenly felt too small, too quiet. My husband had been dead for 32 months, and somehow, in a single moment, I realized there were entire pieces of his life I had never known existed. I sat down slowly on the wooden stool near the workbench, staring at the boy's face. He had Arthur's eyes, the same crooked smile. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. Arthur and I had been married for 41 years. 41 years of Christmas dinners, mortgage payments, hospital visits, anniversaries, and ordinary mornings. I thought I knew every version of that man. But now, sitting alone in the dim garage with rain falling outside, I understood something terrifying. The truth about my husband had been hidden for years, and somehow, I was only just beginning to uncover it. I stayed in the garage until the rain stopped. The photograph rested in my lap while the sky outside slowly darkened into evening, and for the first time since Arthur died, I felt afraid to walk back into my own house. Every room suddenly carried questions instead of memories. I kept staring at the little boy beside him, trying to force my mind towards some harmless explanation. Maybe it was a cousin. Maybe the words on the back were a joke I did not understand. But deep down, something cold had already settled inside me. Arthur never joked like that. He was careful with words, deliberate, the kind of man who folded grocery receipts neatly into his wallet and corrected weather forecasts under his breath. If he wrote, "My real family," then he meant it. That night, I barely touched dinner. I heated canned soup, left it untouched on the kitchen counter, and walked through the house turning lights on one by one even though I was not reading or watching television. Silence felt different now, not peaceful, watchful. Around 9 o'clock, I carried the photograph upstairs and sat at the edge of my bed beneath the quilt Arthur's mother had sewn for us back in 1984. I opened the nightstand drawer where I kept his old letters, anniversary cards, notes he used to leave in my purse before business trips. For nearly an hour, I read through them searching for something I had missed all these years. A strange address, a different name, some clue hidden quietly between ordinary sentences. Instead, all I found were memories of a man who had spent 4 decades telling me I was the center of his life. My eyes drifted toward the hallway closet where Arthur used to keep his winter coats. I do not know why, but suddenly I stood up and walked there barefoot across the cold hardwood floor. The closet still smelled faintly like cedarwood and aftershave. Most of his clothes had been donated after the funeral, but one dark gray coat remained in the back because I could never bring myself to part with it. My hands trembled as I searched through the pockets. Loose change, an old grocery list, a church bulletin from 2 years before he died. Then my fingers brushed against folded paper hidden deep inside the inner lining. I carefully unfolded it and felt my heartbeat begin to pound. It was a receipt from a small motel in northern New Hampshire dated 16 years earlier. 2 guests, 3 nights. Beneath the total charge was a handwritten note in blue ink. "Thank you again for coming. He was so happy to finally have time with you." No signature, no explanation, just enough to make my stomach sink lower than before. I sat on the bedroom floor holding that receipt while the grandfather clock downstairs chimed 10 times through the empty house. And slowly, painfully, I began realizing that Arthur had not simply hidden a secret from me. He had built an entirely different life somewhere beyond the edges of the one we shared. The next morning, I called my son before I could lose my nerve. Daniel answered on the third ring, distracted as always. I could hear traffic in the background and the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Mom, everything okay?" he asked quickly. For a moment, I almost said yes. That old instinct to protect everyone else before myself still lived somewhere deep inside me. But my voice came out quieter than I expected. "Daniel, did your father ever mention a lake cabin in New Hampshire?" There was a pause. Small, barely noticeable. But after 41 years of marriage and 39 years of motherhood, I had learned how much silence can reveal. "A cabin," he repeated carefully. "No." "What?" I stared out the kitchen window at the empty bird feeder hanging crooked beside the maple tree. "I found something of your father's." Another pause. Longer this time. Then came the sound of a car door shutting. "Mom, maybe you are reading too much into old papers," he said gently. Too gently. "Your father traveled for work all the time. You know that." I knew that voice. Daniel used it when he was hiding bad news from me after Arthur's heart attack. Soft, controlled, measured. It made my stomach tighten. "Did you know about this boy?" I asked before I could stop myself. Silence flooded the line completely. I could hear him breathing. Then finally, "What boy?" But he answered too fast. The question sounded rehearsed instead of confused. I closed my eyes. "Daniel." My voice cracked slightly for the first time. "Please do not lie to me." He exhaled heavily, and suddenly he sounded older than his 42 years. Tired. Cornered. "Mom, I think maybe we should talk about this in person." The moment he said that, I knew. Mothers always know. The truth arrived quietly, not like an explosion, but like a slow crack spreading through glass. My own son knew something. Maybe he had known for years. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table while the coffee beside me turned cold. My mind kept replaying small moments from the past decade. Arthur taking private calls outside during Thanksgiving. Daniel driving 2 hours alone every few months without explanation. The strange tension between them sometimes, as if they shared conversations I was never meant to hear. I remembered one Christmas Eve about 8 years earlier when Arthur disappeared for nearly half the day. He claimed his friend Walter had car trouble near Burlington. At the time, I believed him without question because that is what wives do when trust has become habit. But now, for the first time, I wondered if he had spent that Christmas somewhere else. With someone else. The realization hollowed me out slowly from the inside. Not because Arthur had secrets. Everyone carries secrets. But because the two people I trusted most in this world might have shared them together while sitting across from me at the same dinner table for years. Daniel arrived just after sunset carrying the same nervous expression he wore as a teenager whenever he had broken something and hoped I would not notice. I watched him through the front window as he walked slowly up the driveway with his hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, and for one strange moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to come home late after fishing with Arthur by the river. But the second he stepped inside, I knew something between us had already changed. He hugged me, briefly, too briefly, then glanced toward the kitchen table where I had laid out the photograph and motel receipt beside 2 untouched cups of coffee. His eyes landed on them immediately. He did not even pretend surprise. That hurt more than anything. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. Daniel pulled out a chair, but did not sit right away. His shoulders looked tense beneath his dark wool coat. "Mom," he began softly. "It is complicated." I almost laughed at that word. Complicated. 41 years of marriage reduced to one careful little word people use when the truth sounds too ugly spoken out loud. "Do not do that," I said. "Do not protect him anymore." Daniel finally sat down and rubbed both hands across his face like a man carrying exhaustion he could no longer hide. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly behind us. Rain tapped against the windows again. Then he looked at me with eyes full of something I had not expected. "Shame. Dad told me about them 10 years ago," he admitted quietly. My chest tightened so sharply I had to grip the edge of the table. Daniel stared at the photograph. "The boy's name is Caleb. He is your husband's son." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I heard the words clearly, but my mind rejected them anyway. Arthur had another child, another family, another life existing quietly beside ours all those years. Daniel continued speaking carefully, like every sentence might shatter me further. Arthur met Caleb's mother decades before he married me. According to him, the relationship ended before I came into the picture, but years later she contacted him after Caleb started asking questions about his father. I stared at my son in disbelief. "And you knew?" My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. Daniel nodded once, unable to meet my eyes. "Dad made me promise not to tell you. He said he was trying to help financially without destroying the family." Destroying the family. The words echoed bitterly inside my head because sitting there across from my son, I realized the family had already been damaged long before I discovered the truth. I stood slowly and walked toward the sink just to steady myself. Outside, the wind rattled dead leaves across the porch steps. "Every holiday," I whispered. "Every anniversary. Every Sunday dinner. You both sat here looking me in the face." Daniel's silence answered for him. And in that silence, I finally understood something painful. Secrets do not stay hidden because they are impossible to uncover. They stay hidden because the people closest to you decide your right to the truth matters less than their comfort. Daniel stayed at the table long after the coffee turned cold. Neither of us seemed to know how to end the conversation because there are some truths that change the shape of a family forever the moment they are spoken aloud. I stood quietly at the sink staring into the darkness outside while my mind drifted backward through decades of memories that no longer looked the same. Arthur working late 3 nights a week during the early years of our marriage. The unexplained trips. The extra cash withdrawals I used to tease him about. At the time, I thought they were harmless details inside an ordinary marriage. Now every memory felt stained by something hidden beneath it. "Did you ever meet him?" I finally asked without turning around. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yes." The word landed softly, but it felt heavier than anything else that evening. I closed my eyes briefly. "How many times?" "A few," he admitted. "Dad introduced me when Caleb turned 18. 18. That meant my son had carried this secret for nearly 12 years while sitting across from me at birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, and family vacations. I gripped the edge of the counter harder than I realized until my fingers began to ache. "And your wife?" I asked quietly. "Did Emily know too?" Daniel nodded once. "Only for the last few years." A small bitter smile touched my lips before disappearing just as quickly. It amazed me how easily other people had become guardians of a truth that belonged to me. The house suddenly felt crowded with ghosts of conversations I was never allowed to hear. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "Dad loved you. None of this changes that." I turned around then and looked directly at him for the first time since. He arrived. "Do not tell me how your father felt," I said softly. "You did not sit beside me every night believing your marriage was honest." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The silence stretched painfully between us. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. "There is something else," he admitted quietly. He scrolled for a moment before setting the phone face up on the table. It was a recent photograph. Caleb stood beside a woman and 2 small girls near a lake dock somewhere bright and sunny. He looked older now, maybe in his late 30s, with silver beginning at his temples exactly the way Arthur's had started. But what stole the breath from my chest were the little girls smiling beside him. Arthur's smile lived in both their faces too. "Dad stayed in contact with them until the end," Daniel said quietly, "even after he got sick." I stared at the screen while something inside me shifted in a way I could not fully explain. The betrayal still hurt deeply, but beneath the pain was another feeling beginning to emerge. Curiosity, because somewhere out there existed 2 little girls who had no idea I existed either. And suddenly, for the first time since finding that photograph in the garage, I realized I was not the only person who had spent years living beside an incomplete version of the truth. After Daniel left that night, I remained at the kitchen table staring at the photograph on his phone long after the screen had gone dark. 2 little girls, my husband's granddaughters. The thought should have filled me with anger, and part of me was angry, deeply angry in a quiet, exhausted way that settled behind my ribs like winter cold. But another part of me could not stop thinking about how innocent they were in all of this. Children do not create family secrets. They simply inherit the silence adults build around them. Around midnight, I walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed where I kept old family albums. For hours, I turned page after page beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. There was Arthur holding Daniel as a baby on our first apartment balcony in Boston. Arthur teaching Daniel how to ride a bicycle. In the driveway, Arthur standing proudly beside our son at his college graduation with tears in his eyes. Every photograph captured the version of my husband I had loved for 4 decades. Loyal, steady, dependable, and somehow that made everything hurt worse. It would have been easier if he had been cruel. Easier if he had been careless or selfish in obvious ways. But Arthur spent his whole life appearing like a good man, while quietly dividing pieces of himself between 2 separate worlds. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself reaching for the phone before I could change my mind. Daniel had texted me Caleb's number before leaving. Just in case, he had said softly. My thumb hovered over the screen for several seconds, while my heart pounded harder than it had in years. Then finally, I typed a single message. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I believe we need to talk about Arthur. I almost deleted it, but instead, I pressed send. The reply came less than 10 minutes later. I have been wondering for years if I would ever hear from you. I stared at those words while a strange ache spread through my chest. Not triumph, not rage, something sadder than both. Because suddenly I understood that somewhere out there was another person who had also spent years living in the shadow of Arthur's decisions. I did not sleep much that night. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the yard covered in wet golden leaves. I made coffee and sat quietly on the porch wrapped in Arthur's old flannel blanket while the world slowly brightened around me. At exactly 8:17, my phone rang. Caleb. His voice sounded cautious at first, careful in the same way Daniel's had been. But underneath the hesitation was something unmistakable. Nervousness. Mrs. Whitmore, he said softly. I honestly never thought you would contact me. I looked out toward the empty road stretching past my mailbox and closed my eyes briefly. Neither did I admitted. And for the first time since uncovering the truth, I realized the next chapter of my life would not be about protecting Arthur's secrets anymore. It would be about finally hearing the stories that had been hidden from me all along. Caleb and I spoke for almost 2 hours that morning. At first, both of us sounded careful, like strangers trying not to step on broken glass. But slowly, piece by piece, the conversation became less about Arthur and more about the years that had shaped both our lives in silence. Caleb told me he grew up in a small town near Lake Winnipesaukee with his mother, Rachel, who passed away from cancer 6 years earlier. Arthur visited only a few times each year when Caleb was young, usually during summers or around birthdays. According to Caleb, Arthur always described me as a good woman who deserved stability and peace. Hearing that nearly made me laugh from the sadness of it. Stability built on secrets is not stability at all. It is performance. Caleb explained that as he grew older, he stopped expecting Arthur to choose between his 2 families because deep down he already understood the answer. He loved us differently, Caleb said quietly, but he loved us both. I sat silently on the porch swing listening to birds rustle through the wet maple branches overhead while his words settled heavily inside me. I wanted to hate Arthur completely. Some part of me still did. But hatred becomes complicated when it is tied to 41 years of ordinary tenderness. Arthur brought me tea whenever I could not sleep. He warmed up my car during snowstorms. He sat beside my hospital bed after my knee surgery and brushed my hair back from my face when I cried from pain medication confusion. Those memories were real too. That was the hardest part. Caleb eventually asked the question I knew was coming. Did he seem happy with you? I closed my eyes briefly before answering. Most of the time, yes. My voice sounded distant even to myself. At least I believed he was. There was a long silence after that. Then Caleb admitted something unexpected. I used to be jealous of you, he said softly. You got the version of him that belonged in public. The words hit me harder than anything else that morning because suddenly I realized Caleb had also spent his life standing outside a door that never fully opened for him either. Different pain. Same man. By the end of the call, the anger inside me had shifted into something quieter and far more exhausting. Grief for the marriage I thought I had. Grief for the years Caleb lost trying to understand his place in Arthur's life. Grief for Daniel carrying loyalty like a weight he never asked to hold. Before hanging up, Caleb hesitated for a moment and then said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "There is one thing you should know," he said carefully. "Your husband talked about you all the time near the end, especially after he got sick." I tightened the blanket around my shoulders against the cold morning wind. "What did he say?" Caleb's voice softened almost to a whisper. "He said you were the only person he ever truly disappointed." I sat there long after the line disconnected, staring across the quiet road, while tears finally slipped down my face for the first time since finding the photograph in the garage. 3 days later, I drove to New Hampshire to meet Caleb in person. The entire drive north felt strangely familiar, even though I had never taken that route before. Gray clouds drifted low over the mountains, and the trees burned gold and red along the highway like something out of an old postcard Arthur once kept pinned beside his desk. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter every few miles, wondering how many times my husband had driven these same roads carrying pieces of his life between two different worlds. Caleb suggested we meet at a small diner near the lake. When I arrived, he was already sitting in a booth by the window with a coffee cup in front of him and nervousness written all over his face. The moment he stood up, my breath caught painfully in my chest. Seeing photographs had not prepared me for seeing Arthur's expressions alive in another person. The way Caleb tilted his head slightly when uncertain, the faint crease between his eyebrows. Even his smile looked painfully familiar. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly as I approached. I shook my head gently. "Please call me Eleanor." For the first few minutes, conversation moved awkwardly between us. We talked about the weather, the drive, the tourist season around the lake. Two strangers circling around decades of shared damage without knowing where to begin. Then Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and carefully slid a small stack of photographs across the table toward me. "I thought maybe you would want these," he said quietly. My hands trembled as I looked through them one by one. Arthur holding a fishing pole beside a teenage Caleb. Arthur sitting at a picnic table laughing with two little girls climbing across his lap. Arthur standing near the lake at sunset wearing the dark green sweater I gave him for our 35th anniversary. The sight of that sweater nearly broke me because suddenly I understood something devastating. While I was home believing my husband was away on business trips, he had been building memories somewhere else using pieces of the life we shared together. I pressed my fingers carefully against one photograph where Arthur looked older and thinner, taken near the end of his illness. "He looked tired here," I whispered. Caleb nodded quietly. He hesitated before continuing. "Toward the end, he talked a lot about telling you everything himself. He almost did several times." I stared down at the photograph while sadness settled over me in waves. But he never did. Caleb looked out the diner window toward the lake before answering softly. "I think he was afraid that once you knew the whole truth, he would lose the version of himself he spent his life trying to protect." Outside, the wind rippled across the dark water beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. And sitting there across from the man my husband had hidden for decades, I realized something strange. Arthur's secret had not only divided his life, it had trapped him inside it too.